It was an ordinary morning at Metropolitan International Airport. Vanessa Collins, a Harvard-educated attorney, philanthropist, and humanitarian, was preparing for another humanitarian mission to Sudan. Her goal was simple: deliver essential medical supplies to children in a refugee camp. The supplies, carefully packed in her carry-on, were antibiotics and vaccines for children who had been without proper medical care for far too long. As she approached the check-in counter, she expected the usual smooth process of boarding a flight. However, she was about to face something far more challenging. Vanessa handed her first-class boarding pass to the clerk, a middle-aged man who seemed distracted. He scanned the pass but then looked up at her with a brief moment of hesitation. "First class to Paris?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of disbelief. "Are you sure about that booking?" Vanessa paused, surprised. "Yes, I'm sure," she replied calmly, though she couldn't shake the feeling that his tone implied that someone like her didn't belong in first class. The clerk didn't respond further, but handed her the boarding pass with an air of reluctance, still looking uncertain. This wasn't the first time Vanessa had encountered this kind of skepticism. As a successful black woman, she often found herself facing subtle discrimination, whether at a restaurant, in a meeting, or in an airport. Vanessa moved toward the security line, where Officer Jacob Walker, a middle-aged man with a firm posture, stood directing passengers. As she approached the line for expedited screening, she noticed Walker's gaze fixated on her. "Priority screening that way," he said, pointing toward the regular line without even glancing at her boarding pass. Vanessa stopped in her tracks. She knew exactly what this was. She held a first-class ticket, which entitled her to the expedited lane. "I have priority access," she said, handing him her boarding pass. "First-class ticket." Walker looked at the boarding pass, then immediately dismissed it, pointing again to the longer line. "We need to verify that, ma'am," he said, his tone condescending. Vanessa felt a surge of frustration, but she kept her voice steady. "I've been watching. Every other passenger with priority access has been allowed through without issue. Why am I being singled out?" Walker's expression remained cold. "Step aside. You're delaying other passengers." A few travelers nearby started to notice the tension, some of them taking out their phones to record the interaction. Vanessa felt the familiar sting of being judged, not for her ticket, but because of the color of her skin. "I'm not delaying anyone," Vanessa replied, standing her ground. "I'm just asking for the same treatment as everyone else with priority access." Walker's face hardened. "Are you accusing me of something, ma'am?" "No," Vanessa said, her voice firm. "I'm simply pointing out that you've treated me differently than the other passengers." At that moment, Karen Matthews, the terminal supervisor, appeared, clearly alerted to the situation. She glanced briefly at Vanessa and then at Officer Walker. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone already defensive. Vanessa turned to her. "Yes, there is. I've been denied access to the priority lane despite having a valid first-class ticket. Officer Walker has allowed other passengers to go through without verification." Karen didn't even glance at the boarding pass. "Officer Walker is following security protocols," she said quickly, brushing off Vanessa's concern. "Some passengers are randomly selected for additional verification." Vanessa's brow furrowed. "Random? I've been watching for the last 10 minutes and I haven't seen any randomness in the process." Karen shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't say anything more. The small crowd around them had grown, with more people recording the interaction. Vanessa could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, but she stood tall, refusing to let the situation go unchecked. "I'm requesting to speak to someone else," Vanessa said firmly. "This isn't right." Karen turned and walked away without acknowledging her request. Officer Walker, meanwhile, seemed intent on pushing her toward the longer line. But Vanessa wasn't going to let him get away with this. She wasn't just another black woman traveling through an airport. She was someone who would stand up against this injustice, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem to others. Before she stood handcuffed in the airport terminal, Vanessa Collins had been preparing for yet another mission that reflected the core of who she was, someone driven by a sense of duty and compassion. At 32, she was a highly accomplished attorney with a heart that beat for the underserved. Vanessa had been raised in a working-class neighborhood where opportunities were few and dreams had to be fought for. Yet she always knew she wanted to make a difference, and that ambition led her to Harvard Law School. There she excelled, earning both respect and admiration from professors and peers alike. But as her career advanced, so did her desire to help those without a voice, especially in communities with no access to essential healthcare. That crisp autumn morning, the sun poured through the windows of her modest suburban home as Vanessa carefully packed the last of her medical supplies into her carry-on. She double-checked everything: antibiotics, vaccines, and specialized equipment, ensuring it was all securely packed. The supplies were meant for a refugee camp in Sudan, where conditions were dire and basic medical resources were almost non-existent. Children were dying from preventable diseases, and the hospital there had been without critical antibiotics for nearly a month. Vanessa's work had saved many lives before, but this particular mission felt especially important. These children needed more than just medicine. They needed a chance at life, and that was why Vanessa would do whatever it took to help. As she zipped up her bag, her phone rang with the special ringtone she had set for Malcolm Collins, her husband. She smiled when she saw his name on the screen. 10 years of marriage hadn't changed how he looked at her. His love and admiration for her had only grown since they met at college, when both were struggling to make ends meet. Malcolm had come a long way from his days working as a baggage handler at O'Hare Airport. He had put in the long hours, earned his degree, and eventually mortgaged everything to start Skyline Airlines, a small regional carrier that had since become one of the largest in the country. "Everything packed?" Malcolm's deep voice carried over the line, full of warmth, though he sounded fatigued from a long morning of meetings. "Just finished," Vanessa replied, smiling as she thought about the years they had spent building their lives together. "This delivery will make a big difference at the camp. The director said they've been without basic antibiotics for weeks. Hopefully these supplies will help save hundreds of children." Malcolm sighed with a hint of regret. "I wish I could join you this time. There's a board meeting that can't be rescheduled, and the Paris expansion needs final approval. Someone has to keep the airline running." Vanessa laughed softly, understanding his regret. They had both sacrificed so much over the years, but it was their shared vision of changing the world that kept them going. "It's okay," she said. "I'll be fine. Besides, you'll be there for the school opening next month. That's the one I'm looking forward to." Malcolm paused, then added, "I've arranged for Daniel to meet you before your connecting flight. He's the station manager in Paris. He'll make sure everything with the medical supplies goes smoothly." "Malcolm, I can handle a connection like everyone else," Vanessa protested, though she appreciated his concern. "I know you can," Malcolm replied with a chuckle, "but I don't want you to experience any delays." And Daniel insisted when he heard you were coming through. Vanessa smiled at his protectiveness. Even after all these years, Malcolm still went above and beyond to make sure she was taken care of. But Vanessa had never been one to flaunt her connections or status. Despite being married to one of the most successful CEOs in the country, she preferred to travel anonymously, often flying commercial and sometimes even in economy class. It gave her a better understanding of the systems she wanted to improve. Today, however, the first-class ticket was a rare concession for the long flight ahead. She would be in Sudan for weeks, and the work was going to be grueling. The flight would give her the rest she needed to be at her best when she arrived. The car that Malcolm had arranged for her was not a limousine, but a modest sedan with a trusted driver who had worked for them for years. As it pulled into the busy international terminal, Vanessa double-checked her passport, tucked her foundation identification into her purse, and took a deep breath. The familiar mix of excitement and anxiety settled in. Excited for the lives she would change, anxious for the difficult work ahead. But what she couldn't have known was that her greatest challenge wouldn't come in a refugee camp in Sudan. It would come right here, in this American airport, at the hands of an officer who saw her as nothing more than a black woman who didn't belong in first class. Vanessa's journey had started like any other, but as she approached the security checkpoint at Metropolitan International Airport, things began to take a turn. She had already passed through check-in without incident, though the subtle judgment at the counter still stung. Now, as she stood at the entrance to the security lanes, she felt a growing sense of unease. Despite her first-class ticket and priority access, she knew that something about this airport wasn't quite right. Something told her this trip would be more difficult than expected. Officer Jacob Walker was stationed at the front of the security line, his eyes scanning the crowd as passengers filtered through. When he saw Vanessa, his gaze lingered just a moment too long, and she could feel the tension building. The look on his face told her everything. He was sizing her up, deciding whether she belonged in the first-class lane or if she should be treated like anyone else. She stepped forward, holding her boarding pass out, prepared for the usual process. But Walker didn't even glance at it. Instead, he stepped directly into her path and pointed toward the regular security line. "Regular screening that way, ma'am," he said with a stern, uninviting tone. Vanessa froze for a moment. She had experienced subtle racism and discrimination before, but this was blatant and it felt different. "I have priority access," she replied, her voice steady. She showed him her boarding pass. "First-class ticket. I should be able to go through the expedited screening." Walker glanced at the boarding pass but made no move to acknowledge her entitlement. "We'll need to verify that," he said, his voice dismissive. "Please step aside." Vanessa stood her ground. She had traveled enough to know that first-class passengers were given expedited access. She had done everything right, paid for her ticket, followed all the procedures. She wasn't going to let someone's prejudice stand in her way. "There's no need to verify it," she said, keeping her voice calm. "Every other passenger with priority access has been allowed through without a problem." Walker ignored her, gesturing again toward the longer line. "Step aside," he insisted, his tone more forceful now. "You're holding up the line." Vanessa's patience was wearing thin, but she refused to let anger take control. She was used to handling difficult situations with calm, dignity, and logic. "I've been standing here for several minutes, and I've watched you let other passengers through without questioning them. Why am I being treated differently?" Walker's expression hardened. "You don't need to question my procedures, ma'am," he snapped, his voice rising with a slight edge. "I decide who goes where." Vanessa knew exactly what this was about. She wasn't just being treated like any other first-class passenger. She was being treated like she didn't belong. There was no reason for her to be singled out. She had done everything right, yet here she was, being questioned in a way no one else had been. A few passengers had started to notice, some taking out their phones to record the interaction. Their eyes flicked between Vanessa and the officer, the tension thick in the air. "Officer," Vanessa said, trying to stay composed, "I'm simply asking for equal treatment. Every other passenger with a first-class ticket has been allowed through without issue. Why am I being treated this way?" Walker's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being questioned, especially not in front of an audience. "Step aside or I'll have to call a supervisor," he threatened, his voice cold. At that moment, Karen Matthews, the terminal supervisor, approached. She had been alerted to the situation by another officer who had been watching the interaction unfold. She looked from Vanessa to Walker and back again, her eyes darting nervously. "Is there a problem here?" Karen asked, her voice tight. Vanessa turned to her. "Yes, there is. I've been denied access to the priority lane despite having a valid first-class ticket. Officer Walker has allowed other passengers to pass without issue, but is treating me differently." Karen barely glanced at Vanessa's boarding pass. "Officer Walker is simply following security protocols," she said quickly. "Some passengers are selected for additional verification. It's a random process." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. She had been standing there long enough to notice a pattern, and it wasn't random. "Random? I've been observing for 10 minutes, and the pattern doesn't seem random at all. I'm being singled out." Karen shifted uncomfortably but didn't offer a response. The small crowd of onlookers had grown, and now more phones were out, recording the interaction. Vanessa felt a growing sense of isolation, but she wasn't about to back down. This wasn't just about her, it was about the systemic treatment of people like her, people who didn't fit the narrow, prejudiced view of who deserved to be treated with respect. "I would like to speak to your supervisor," Vanessa said firmly, her voice unwavering. "This is discriminatory treatment, and I'm not going to let it go unnoticed." Karen looked away, clearly uninterested in helping. Officer Walker, however, didn't seem to care about the growing crowd or the recording phones. He was too focused on his sense of control. But Vanessa wasn't just another passenger. She was an individual who understood the power of her voice, and she wasn't about to let it be silenced. As Vanessa stood firm at the security checkpoint, her mind raced, but her resolve only grew stronger. She knew she had every right to be there, in that priority lane, with her first-class ticket. But Officer Jacob Walker had made his decision. He wasn't going to let her through. His prejudices were clear now, and she wasn't about to let them slide. With the crowd still watching and recording, Vanessa remained calm. She understood that this was more than just a personal confrontation. It was about exposing the systemic discrimination that people like her faced every day. But even with that clarity, she knew she needed more than just her own voice to make this right. She needed someone who could bring weight to the situation. "Officer Walker, I'm requesting that you call your supervisor again." "This isn't acceptable," Vanessa said, her voice unwavering. Walker didn't respond, but his face grew red with frustration. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone he thought he could easily dismiss. But Vanessa wasn't backing down. Her patience was being tested, but she refused to allow him to win this power struggle. A few more moments passed, and Vanessa pulled out her phone, dialing the one person she knew could make a difference. Malcolm Collins, her husband, wasn't just any man. He was the CEO of Skyline Airlines, the airline that operated the very terminal they were standing in. A man with power, influence, and an undeniable presence in the aviation industry. As the phone rang, Vanessa's pulse quickened, not because she was worried, but because she knew that things were about to change. When Malcolm picked up, her voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable sense of urgency. "Malcolm, it's me," Vanessa said calmly. "I need you here at Terminal B, International Department, Security Checkpoint 7. Officer Jacob Walker is trying to arrest me on fabricated charges." Malcolm's voice on the other end was filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone softening instantly. "I'm fine," Vanessa reassured him. "I've stayed calm, but this has gone too far. There are witnesses and everything is being recorded. I need you here now." Malcolm didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." Vanessa hung up, still holding her ground as she waited for her husband to arrive. She could feel the eyes of the onlookers on her, and it made her heart heavy. But she had no intention of allowing Officer Walker to get away with what he was doing. Minutes later, a ripple of tension seemed to spread across the terminal. Security personnel began moving more swiftly, and there was a noticeable shift in the air. The calm, confident demeanor of Malcolm Collins, the CEO of Skyline Airlines, commanded immediate attention. As Vanessa looked up, she saw him. He was walking toward her, flanked by several members of his team, people who had been part of the airline's rise from humble beginnings to one of the most successful regional carriers in the country. Malcolm Collins was no longer the baggage handler who had once worked nights to pay for his education. He was now a man whose presence alone demanded respect. Vanessa's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't flinch. She could already see the panic in Officer Walker's eyes as he realized who had just arrived. This was the moment of reckoning, the moment when everything would change for him. "Malcolm," Vanessa said softly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "Thank you for coming." Malcolm didn't respond immediately. His eyes locked onto Officer Walker, who had now grown visibly uncomfortable. The officer had crossed a line. He had underestimated the woman standing in front of him. He had no idea who she was married to, or how deeply his actions were about to cost him. "Is there a problem here?" Malcolm's voice was calm, but it carried a weight of authority that made people stop and listen. He didn't need to shout. His presence was enough to demand attention. Officer Walker's face went pale, and he stammered for a moment, trying to find the words. I'm just following procedures, sir," he said, his voice shaky, but it was clear that he wasn't sure if he could explain his actions anymore. "Procedures?" Malcolm repeated, his tone hardening. "This woman, my wife, is being singled out for no reason other than the color of her skin. She's a first-class passenger, and she has every right to be in the priority lane. What you've done here is unacceptable." The realization of who Vanessa was hit Officer Walker like a freight train. Malcolm Collins, the CEO of Skyline Airlines, the man who had built an empire from the ground up, was standing before him. His arrogance, his belief that he could control the situation, began to crumble. He wasn't dealing with just any passenger. He was facing a man who had the power to destroy him. A small crowd had gathered, and their phones were still recording, capturing every moment. The situation was escalating quickly, and there was no going back for Officer Walker now. The weight of his mistake was too significant to ignore. "I need you to release my wife immediately," Malcolm said, his voice carrying the full authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. "What you've done here is an abuse of power, and I won't stand for it." As Malcolm stood there, calm and commanding, Officer Walker's confidence was shattered. He had no response, no way to defend his actions. He was caught in his own racism, caught in his own bias. But the truth had been revealed, and as the airport staff and bystanders began to grasp the full weight of what had just happened, Officer Walker finally realized that he had made the biggest mistake of his career. As Officer Walker stood frozen, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of Malcolm Collins' presence, the atmosphere in the terminal shifted. Vanessa Collins had been humiliated, but now it was time for the consequences to fall squarely on those who had wronged her. Malcolm didn't raise his voice, but his authority was unmistakable. "You will release my wife immediately," he said, each word precise, "and you will be held accountable for what you've done here." The crowd around them had grown, many now aware of the tension, others watching in disbelief at the escalation. Some people had already begun sharing their recordings of the interaction, the footage showing Officer Walker's clear discriminatory behavior. The weight of the situation was not lost on anyone. It was more than just a confrontation at an airport. It was a moment that exposed a deeper, systemic problem, and now it was about to be addressed. Karen Matthews, the terminal supervisor who had earlier dismissed Vanessa's concerns, now approached cautiously, her demeanor shifting from indifference to anxiety. She glanced between Malcolm, Vanessa, and Officer Walker, clearly realizing that the situation was escalating beyond anything she could manage. "I'll handle this, Karen," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. "Get the security footage. We'll be reviewing every moment of this." He turned to Officer Walker. "You will be suspended immediately. We will be pressing charges for this." Walker's face drained of color as the gravity of what he had done sank in. His career, his reputation, all of it was slipping away in that instant. He had targeted the wrong person, and the consequences would ripple through his life in ways he couldn't yet fathom. As the minutes passed, security personnel arrived to take over, and Officer Walker's fate was sealed. The footage was reviewed, and it was clear. Walker had discriminated against Vanessa solely because of her race, singling her out and treating her unfairly, despite the fact that she had every right to be in the priority lane. The evidence was irrefutable. Malcolm looked at Karen Matthews one last time. "I want a full investigation into this. This isn't just about one officer. It's about systemic issues here at this airport. We will not let this go unnoticed." As the investigation into Officer Walker's actions began, Malcolm Collins used his influence to push for systemic changes, not just within the airport, but across the industry. He demanded that body cameras be implemented for all security personnel to ensure that every passenger was treated fairly and without prejudice. He insisted on mandatory anti-bias training for all airport staff and demanded that discriminatory practices be rooted out from top to bottom. The policies were changed quickly. Within a matter of days, the airport announced reforms that would hold all employees accountable for their actions, regardless of their rank or position. Vanessa's foundation, already known for its humanitarian work, became a driving force behind advocating for changes in how public services handled discrimination and bias. As for Officer Walker, his career was over. He was reassigned to the newly created Community Relations Division, where he would spend the next several months learning about respect, understanding, and the very biases he had acted upon. His suspension was just the beginning of his long road to redemption, or at least an attempt at it. Months later, as Vanessa boarded another flight, this time without any incident, she felt a sense of justice. Her treatment at the airport had sparked a national conversation about race, privilege, and the selective application of respect. Her fight had not been in vain. The changes that had been put in place would benefit countless others who traveled through the airport, ensuring they would never have to face the same discrimination. As she settled into her first-class seat, this time without question or hesitation, she reflected on the journey she had been through. The road to justice was long, but sometimes it only took one person, one moment to make the system change. Her phone buzzed with a message from Malcolm, as always thinking of her. "We've made it through. I'm proud of you. See you soon in Paris." She smiled, knowing that despite the challenges, The world was slowly shifting toward the equality she had always fought for. And the fight wasn't over. There were still many more battles ahead. But now, every time she boarded a flight, it was a reminder. Change was possible, and justice could be achieved.